So, Vostok. Well, some people love them and some people hate them. But if you love them, then they do tend to multiply like rabbits. And it's been a while since I've had a Vostok on the channel, which isn't entirely my fault. See, I was looking for one that was a little different to show next, and I actually found one, or at least I thought I found one, in this 24-hour Komandirskie. Yet I made the mistake of buying it off eBay rather than directly through Marinome, and the one I ordered on eBay just never showed up. And after a few months of waiting, I contacted the seller who offered to send a second one, which also never showed up. So at that point I pretty much gave up on it and went to Marinome to look for something else. Which is where I ran across this special edition Vostok also with a 24-hour dial. But more interestingly, it also has a fully lumed dial. And this is in a 420 Amphibia case, which is actually what my other Amphibia is. And I double checked before doing this video, and this fully lumed version does appear to be sold out on Marinome. And I've never really been sure if those special edition Vostoks ever come back in stock, or that's pretty much it. But even if they don't, there is a black version of this, as well as you can still get a good idea of what the other 24-hour Vostoks are like. So let's just jump right in and take a closer look. If you didn't know, Vostoks are rather modular. There's a wide selection of different cases, movements, and dials, and if you look, you can pretty much find different combinations of all of them. Or if you're inclined, you can actually make your own. And this one, like my modded orange scuba dude, uses a 420 Amphibia case, which I believe is the most minimal and really smallest out of the Amphibia line. It's listed at 39mm wide, and I found it to be just over that at 39.4, and that's without the crown. With the crown, it's only 43.7. Now, lug-to-lug is also rather short at just under 46mm. So if you really like smaller divers or have a smaller wrist, then the 420 case is really going to be your best bet. I think it's also the only Amphibia that uses 18mm straps as well. So everything about this watch is just a little on the smaller side, especially for a 200-meter diver. The only exception to that is the total thickness at 15.1mm, and that's all because Amphibious use this domed lucite or polymer crystal. Now, I've gone into the history and the design of the Amphibious in the past, but it's always worth talking about again for those that aren't familiar with Vostok. And the short version is that the original design goes back to Soviet Russia in the late 60s, and back then they were tasked with designing a 200-meter dive watch. The traditional method for designing a diver is just to really overbuild it so that it can withstand those pressures at depth. But for a variety of reasons, the Soviets just couldn't do it, primarily because their machining equipment wasn't capable of creating the tight tolerances that were necessary to actually do that. So they had to come up with a completely different solution. Basically, they designed the Amphibia to work with the pressure and not against it. And with that, there are two key components, and those are the caseback and the crystal. Underneath both of them, there is a large flat gasket, and when it comes to the caseback, the pressure as you go down to depth increases and then pushes that caseback further into the gasket, creating a better seal. And with the polymer crystal, at depth that crystal flexes and actually flattens, again to create more of a surface area and more pressure against that seal to increase its water resistance. And in some ways, this is really one of the reasons that some of us are fascinated with Vostoks. The Soviet era design and engineering is just very different and a very different philosophy than what we were doing in the West. Unlike other Vostok cases, the 420 really isn't much of one. It's basically just a frame for the dial and bezel and just really looks like a porthole, with only these curved but really narrow lugs coming out of it. The case is stainless, although I'm not really sure what grade of stainless they use. And the finishing is really a bit of a mixed bag. The top and sides of the case are good, as is the caseback. Where that finishing falls apart, however, is on the underneath of the case and also inside the lugs. While they look okay, they have very sharp edges and angles in those transitions, and especially on the inside of the lugs where you would normally expect to see a bracelet. The caseback here is different than some other watches you might be used to. And here's some footage from when I modded my orange scuba dude. The caseback is really just secured by a ring that screws it down into place and really pushes it against that large gasket. And I think this also has an added benefit of less wear on that gasket as it's just being pushed down instead of twisted. There are also a variety of different Vostok casebacks, and this one has an Antarctica one, which I do like, but I think my overall favorite is the Orca one. The 420 case doesn't have any crown guards to speak of, but the special edition one does come with a stainless side crown. Now, if you're not familiar with Vostok, then the stem and floppy crown might appear odd if not broken. But it's actually a protective mechanism for the movement, so it's really more of a quirk than an issue. And you just have to put a slight amount of pressure outward in order to wind it. The movement this Vostok uses is a 2431.01, and unlike most other Vostoks, this one actually has a 24-hour hand. But, like other Vostoks, this one doesn't have any hacking, and it is a low beat movement at 19,800 beats per hour, so that second hand will appear just a little less smooth than you would with a standard beat rate. But the side benefit of that means that there's also less wear and tear on the gears over time compared to a standard beat rate. And the power reserve here might be a little less than what you're used to at just over 31 hours rather than your typical 40. But that's just all part of the wonderful quirks of Vostok ownership. While I usually prefer a date on my watch, Vostoks don't have a quick set date function. So with them, I actually prefer a non-date version like this one. And in this case, I think it's better that way as it really gives it a nice clean dial. Now, most Amphibious also have a brass chrome-coated bezel, but the special edition one actually comes with stainless, and it actually really looks nice. It has a black aluminum insert with a lume pip just at the top. And the only problem I've had with it is that the protective plastic that was covering that bezel sort of got stuck underneath that lume pip. And if you look close, there's actually a small amount of it there. I've been trying to get it out, but I've been a little cautious as I don't want to scratch that insert with tweezers. Now, like most other Vostoks, this does have their standard bidirectional free-floating bezel. And it's a pretty simple design, just basically held on with a retaining wire, which does make it very easy to swap out if you're inclined. But it also means that they can be either loose or too tight, just really depends on your luck when you get one. You can always adjust that tension of the wire later, but sometimes it is a pain. Although luckily with this one, I'd say it's just right. Most of the case here is brushed, but that bezel edge is polished, which I think stands out nicely. And I think it looks really good against that black insert. The bezel edge here doesn't stick out too far, so it can be a little hard to grab and get a hold of. But the easiest place to grab it is actually in between the lugs, which is where I discovered how sharp the edge of the finishing is there. And we've already talked about how the design of the crystal is really vital to its water resistance. But I think it's also worth talking about that it is polymer, and that polymer does come with the typical pros and cons with a polymer crystal. It's nice and clear and just looks great when new, not to mention that it's very appropriate for design from the late 60s. Yet it can scratch easily, although often you can buff out those light scratches yourself. And if you can't, well, the crystal should be cheap and rather easy to replace. Or even to more of an extreme, you could order a whole new case with crystal for around 25 bucks off Marino. And that's partially why some people just love Vostok. That's just cheap and easy access to a variety of parts and components to just customize and really create something of your own. Which then leads us to the dial. And the dial here is a rather simple execution. There's nothing really applied. You just have this off-white, ghost-looking dial with black paint on it. At least when the lights are on, it looks that way. Now you also have the typical Vostok arrow-shaped hands, but rather than the silver outline that I've had before, this is a very nice dark black outline. And the inside of those arrows is actually the same color as the dial, so there's really not much contrast there. But that black outline is pretty thick, and it really lets those hands stand out against the dial. And if I haven't made it clear enough yet, that 24-hour dial isn't just there for a look. The main hour hand does run on a 24-hour scale. The dial here is divided into 4 sections from a center crosshair, and I think that's actually quite effective with a 24-hour dial. You also have hour indicators just for the even hours, while you have dashes for the odd, as well as additional minute indicators on the chapter ring. While the edge of the dial does look rather crowded, especially later in the day, I think those minute indicators are really vital to making the dial easier to read, at least until you get used to a 24-hour dial. Now luckily, I do have some experience with my Glycine Airman, And I think the key is to remember that the even hour indicators are really the only ones that matter, and just completely ignore the odd when reading the minute. Which is why I think the even indicators here are in Arabic numerals. But even remembering that, I think there is going to be just a little bit of a learning curve here. And other than some additional flavor text on the dial, that's pretty much it here. It's just simple, easy to read dial, which I think is really what you'd expect from a watch with a military background. And if you're someone that really hates the more colorful Vostok dials, then some of these clean-cut ones, especially the special edition ones, are probably worth checking out. Now, as for the Lume, well, I did pick this one as I've never had a fully loomed dial, and in many ways they are a little bit of a novelty. The dials never really seem to last as long as you would like them, but I really wanted to check this one out anyways. And I do have to say that the effect is just really striking and really cool. Now, as divers go, I think the Lume Vostok uses is a bit subpar, but as all watches go, I think it kind of ranks as just, well, being okay. So my biggest question here is really how well does this special edition version compare, and especially the Lume on the dial. So for comparison, I just put it up against two other Amphibious, as well as a Chinese watch from AliExpress to make sure it's at least better than that. Now, from the very beginning, it's just clear that the hands are brighter than the dial, which is really what you want anyways. And that dial really doesn't last near as long as I would like, but at least you can still see it after 40 minutes, if not barely. The hands, however, are just as good as the other Vostoks. So overall, I'd say the Lume here is, well, it's a Vostok. That's pretty much all you need to say. And lastly, let's talk about the strap. Now, while Vostok's bracelets have gotten better in recent years, they generally have a really bad reputation when it comes to their bracelet. Most people just immediately take it off and throw it into a drawer, really never to be seen again, with some not even stopping to remove the plastic first. But here we don't have that problem. There are a variety of straps to choose for this watch, but I chose the Silicon Tropic style strap, and I have to say that this strap is really surprisingly good. I have no idea who makes it for them, but I'd easily buy another. I think the strap really only has two faults. The first is that with my 7-inch wrist, there are really only 4 holes left, so if you do have a bigger wrist, then this might not fit. And the other is that the strap is just a little bit flimsy when you're trying to hold the watch by itself. But that also translates into that strap being extremely comfortable on the wrist. And while on the wrist, it just stays exactly where it needs to. And I think that strap with this rather minimal case just make an ideal watch for the summer heat. And I really like how that black strap just matches the bezel, as well as matching the paint on the dial. In fact, I think I really love how the whole thing looks as a package. That said, I think long term I would actually change out this bezel to a 24-hour bezel, and hopefully one that shares a very similar look. I just think with that 24-hour hand, a 24-hour bezel would go perfect with it in order to track a second time zone, which would be perfect for dive trips to just really more exotic locations, maybe places that you don't want to take a nice expensive watch. And if anyone at Vostok is listening, you really need to make a regular Amphibia like this, especially with that 24-hour dial. It just creates a very inexpensive Russian version of a Glycine Airman, and there really isn't anything else like that on the market right now. Now, the big question, of course, is price, as a regular Amphibia will run you around $60 to $80, just depending on where you're buying it from. So is this one really worth 50% more? Well, it kinda is. Upgrading to a steel bezel is usually around $15 to $20, and a steel crown is usually around another $8. And I'd say that strap is probably worth at least $15, so it kinda works out. But the main thing here, of course, is that special edition look, as well as that fully loomed dial. And those by themselves are really worth it for me. But if you're just wanting a regular Amphibia, there are always plenty of other options out there. And if you do want a 24-hour Vostok, well, those Komandirskie versions are usually around $80. And I do have another Amphibia that I will be reviewing shortly, and if I haven't made an announcement that goes along with it, I will be making that shortly as well. Otherwise, I think you all know the drill. Just leave a comment down below letting me know what you think about this Vostok Amphibia, or if there are any other Vostoks I should take a look at. And with regard to the Vostok Classica, which I think people have mentioned in the past, It is one I'm interested in, but they're currently all sold out, and I'm not sure if they're ever coming back. Otherwise, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.